Hello, it's Steph, and today I'm here to talk about the straight stitch. So the way this video is going to be divided into is that there's going to be about like two parts. First part is that I'm going to show you how it's done, and then the second part is going to be me talking about its uses and whatnot, just in case you're interested in seeing one or the other, so let's get into it. To reiterate the settings on my sewing machine, I have thread tension, needle position, thread width, thread length, and stitch style. When I do a straight stitch, my tension I typically keep around 5. This machine goes all the way up to 9 and the lowest is 0. Whenever I work with different fabrics, I always make sure to test my tension, but I usually keep it around 5. I don't mess with needle position, but you can shift it left or right. As for width, since we are doing a straight stitch, it should stay at 0. My stitch length is at a special setting, but for a straight stitch, so most of the time, I keep it between 2 and 3, at about 2.5. For the stitch style of all these lovely stitches, we will stay on this setting for the straight stitch. That is it for the settings of a straight stitch, so now I will show you how it looks. Taking this fabric I have laying around and setting down the sewing foot, I hand crank the needle to insert it into the fabric, and then I start sewing. For a typical straight stitch, you will start slow and make a couple of stitches, and then you will press this lever right here that says reverse in order to do a back stitch. Backstitching goes over the stitches you just made to reinforce them and ensure that it doesn't come undone. Then we can continue onward until we are done sewing, and then at the end we do the same thing. We backstitch again to finish it off. Make sure the needle is up, lift up the sewing foot, and then you can take it off your machine. My back stitches were not the straightest, but this is how it turns out. You can see there is a bit of puckering with the thread, so this is the sort of fabric I would lower my thread tension a little bit for to try to reduce that. And again, this is a good example of why it is always a good idea to test your stitch settings before you start actually sewing your fabric. And that is how you do the standard straight stitch. I think it's a really useful stitch because there are so many different variations that are used in sewing. It's super straightforward, it's just a bunch of settings on your machine. It is generally the stitch that you'll use whenever you're sewing things together, with some exceptions of course, but this is pretty much the default standard stitch that you'll be using. It's also really useful for two things that I do, I feel, ever so often with my sewing projects. The first is basting. If you are doing a basting stitch, the only difference is that your stitch length would be set to 4 instead of 2.5, and when you sew, you will not use the reverse lever to backstitch. This is how the stitches differ side by side. Regular straight stitches will have the back stitching and the stitches are much closer together, whereas the basting stitch has no back stitches and the stitches are further apart. The second thing that I find super useful that is variation of the straight stitch is something called edge stitching. Edge stitching is basically when you're stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of your garment or whatever you're working on, and the whole point of edge stitching is typically for reinforcement or for decoration. It's also very similar to a top stitch or an understitch, I believe. But that pretty much covers that. If you have any other questions, comments, concerns, as usual, let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video useful, make sure to give me a thumbs up, but if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. Thanks so much for checking out my video, and I will catch you next time.